Dear students, welcome to this lecture series. Today, we will be discussing the conflict theory with special reference to Karl Marx. First of all, we will have a look on the objectives. Number 1, to highlight the inevitability of conflict in society. Number 2, to establish a link between conflict and social change. And number 3, to show the cause and effect relationship between different events in society. Now, we will have a look on the central idea of this theory. Dear students, along with functionalism, conflict theory was sociology's first theoretical orientation. Briefly speaking, it is a development in reaction to structural functionalism. Conflict perspective emphasizes conflict, competition, change, and constraint within a society, whereas the evolutionary and equilibrium perspectives are based on the assumption that society is inherently stable. The conflict perspective depicts society as unstable with ever-present conflict and inconsistency. Well, social and cultural change occurs as a result of the struggles and conflict among groups representing different segments of a society, which results in social change. The conflict perspective sees scarcity of desired resources over which groups are in conflict as the major source of social instability that characterizes all societies. Conflict theory began with Karl Marx, 1818–1883. Development of theory owes a debt to early German sociologists Max Weber, 1864–1920, and George Simmel, 1858–1918 also. Later, Lewis Koser and Ralph Dahrendorf also got involved. So friends, before we proceed, let's have a look at the biographical sketch of Karl Marx. Well, Karl Marx was born in Trier, a commercial city in Western Germany, in 1818. He attended university first in Bonn and then in Berlin in order to study law, where Marx joined radical philosophical circle influenced by a German philosopher, Hegel. After graduation, he became the editor-in-chief of a liberal radical newspaper, which was later closed for its anti-government articles. Here starts the worldwide influence of Marx. Dear friends, he went to Paris in 1843, where he was exiled under the pressure from Prussia for his radical ideas. Marx finally settled in London, where he freely worked on and analyzed the capitalist system, which also made a debut of his movement. Friends, here in London, his work brought a theoretical focus to empirical social analysis. Marx provided a theory to understand a connection between the concrete economic relationship among people and the broad patterns of social order that emerge from them in specific eras. He represents the epitome of the scholar activist, the social critic who is, to paraphrase Marx's own words, not content with criticizing the world, but who is also trying to change it. Now, dear students, let's have a look on the central theme of class conflict. In all stratified societies, there are two major social groups, a ruling class and a subject class. The power of the ruling class derives from its ownership and control of the forces of production, and the ruling class oppresses and exploits the subject class. As a result, there is a basic conflict of interests between the two classes. The various institutions of society, such as the legal and political systems, are institutions of ruling class domination and serve to further its interests. Now, we will have a look on the basic features of Marx's conflict theory. Marx is usually taken to have meant a group of people in similar situations with respect to their control of the means of production. This is, however, an incomplete description of the way Marx used the term. For Marx, class was always defined in terms of its potential for conflict. Individuals form a class insofar as they are in a common conflict with others over a surplus value. Now, we will discuss the four main epochs of history with respect to class conflict: primitive communism, ancient society, feudal society, and capitalist society. Primitive society. The land and its products were communally owned. Classes did not exist, since all members of society shared the same relation to the forces of production. Every member was both a producer and the owner. All provided labor power and shared the products of their labor. For this reason, there was no conflict. Classes emerged when the productive capacity of society expanded beyond the level required for subsistence. This occurred when agriculture became the dominant mode of production. As agriculture developed, surplus wealth, that is, goods above the basic subsistence needs of the community, was produced. This led to an exchange of goods, which was finally accompanied by the development of a system of private property. Goods were increasingly seen as commodities or articles of trade, to which the individual, rather than the community, had the right of ownership. Thus, private property and the accumulation of surplus wealth formed the basis for the development of class societies. In particular, they provide the precondition for the emergence of class of producers and a class of non-producers. Some are able to acquire the forces of production and others are therefore obliged to work for them. The result is a class of non-producers, which owns the forces of production, and a class of producers which owns only its labor power. The rise of horticulture, which Marx believed was a product of technical advance, introduced significant patterns of social inequality to human societies. Warfare produced human captives who typically became slaves. Slaves and masters were locked into an irreconcilable pattern of social conflict. In the later agrarian societies, from then on, all societies are divided into two major classes: masters and slaves in ancient society, lords and serfs in feudal society, capitalists and wage laborers in capitalist society. Marx himself puts it, the history of all hitherto societies is the history of class conflict. During each historical epoch, the labor power required for production was supplied by the subject class. These classes were the slaves, the serfs, the wage laborers, respectively. Thus, during the feudal epoch, there are two major classes distinguished by their relationship to land, the major force of production. They are the feudal nobility, who own the land, and landless serfs, who work the land. Similarly, in the capitalist era, there are two main classes: the bourgeoisie or capitalist class, which owns the forces of production, and the proletariat or working class, whose members own only their labor, which they hire to the bourgeoisie in return for wages. Now we will have a look on one of the important concepts of Karl Marx with relation to his conflict theory, and that is economic determinism. Production of food and material are objects for survival. Thus, man enters into social relationships. Production is a social enterprise, so it requires a cooperation. Economic system is of utmost importance in shaping a society. The economic system as the infrastructure of society. Dear friends, social institutions, family, the political system, legal and educational institutions, and religion as society's superstructure are built on economic system. The forces of production and the social relationships of production form the economic base or infrastructure of society. Superstructure is shaped by the infrastructure. Now, we will have a look on the products and the means of production. To satisfy needs, men created material products like houses, roads and vehicles, etc., which formed a material basis of regulated social life. In working upon their material environment, men developed certain instruments or means of production, a certain technology which was of a definite material nature. The products and the means of production therefore constituted a fundamental material basis of society. The making and the distribution of products meant some necessary property relations among men. Now, relation of men to each other, that is social classes. Men held different positions of power or lack of power, of status or lack of status, of property or lack of property. Men sharing the same positions in this economic order would also share an identity of interests. The relations of men to the means of production led directly to the formation of class relations and finally to class conflict. Economic basis of society consisted of the material products and the means of production, the relations of men to them and the system of social classes. Now we will have a look on the concept of surplus value of the conflict theory of Karl Marx. The rate of surplus value is an exact expression for the degree of the exploitation of the labor power by capital or of the laborer by the capitalist. As Marx said, capital is dead labor that vampire-like only lives by sucking living labor and lives the more labor it sucks. Marx basically argues that the structure and the ethos of capitalism push the capitalists in the direction of the accumulation of more and more capital. Marx's view is that labor is the source of value. The capitalists are led to intensify the exploitation of the proletariat. This derives class conflict. Now friends, we will have a look on the concept of alienation. Alienation simply means that man is cut off from his work. As such, he is unable to find satisfaction and fulfillment in performing his labor or in the products of his labor. For Marx, the history of mankind has a double aspect. It was a history of increasing control of man over nature, as it was a history of an increasing alienation of man. It can be described as a condition in which men are dominated by forces of their own creation, which confront them as alien powers. Work provided the most important means to fulfill basic human needs, individuality, and humanity. Friends, by expressing personality in the creation of a product, the worker can experience a deep satisfaction. In seeing his product used and appreciated by others, he satisfies his needs and thereby expresses his care and humanity for others. Marx argues that alienation springs initially from the exchange of goods in some form of market system. Here develops the idea and practice of private property, the individual ownership of the forces of production, illustrated by capitalist economies in which the ownership of the forces of production is concentrated in the hands of a small minority. Alienation is increased by the fact that workers do not own the goods they produce. Now, we will have a brief look over the four basic components of alienation. First, the workers in capitalist society are alienated from their productive activity. Workers do not produce objects according to their own ideas or to directly satisfy their own needs. They work for capitalists, who pay them a subsistence wage in return for the right to use the workers in any way they see fit. Workers perform highly specialized tasks and as a result have little sense of their role in the total production process. Second, the workers are alienated not only from productive activities but also from the object of those activities, in other words, the product. The product of their labor does not belong to the workers. It belongs to capitalists, who may use it in any way they wish because the product is the capitalist's private property. Third, alienated from fellow workers, Marx assumed that people basically want to work cooperatively in order to appropriate from nature what they require to survive. In capitalism, this cooperation is disrupted, and people, often strangers, are forced to work side by side for the capitalist. Even if the workers on the assembly line are close friends, the nature of the technology makes for a great deal of isolation. The workers are often forced into outright competition and sometimes conflict with one another. For maximum productivity and to prevent the development of cooperative relationships, the capitalist pits one worker against another to please the boss. The isolation and the interpersonal hostility tend to make workers in capitalism alienated from their fellow workers. Fourth, workers in capitalist society are alienated from their own human potential. Individuals perform less and less like human beings as they are reduced in their work to machines. Even their smiles and greetings are programmed and scripted. The result is a mass of people who are unable to express their essential human qualities, a mass of alienated workers. Marx saw two important characteristics of industrial society: the mechanization of production and a further specialization of division of labor as contributing to the alienation of the workforce. After discussing all the concepts of Karl Marx, we will have a broad look over his basic theory, that is class conflict. Marx's class theory rests on the premise that the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle. According to this view, ever since human society emerged from its primitive and relatively undifferentiated state, it has remained fundamentally divided between classes who clash in the pursuit of interests. Students, Marx argues that in the earlier epochs of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, a manifold gradation of social rank. In ancient Rome, there were patricians, plebeians, knights, and slaves. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guild masters, and journeymen, apprentices, serfs. In almost all of these classes, again, there were further subordinate gradations. The modern capitalist society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society, which established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. But our epoch, that is, the epoch of capitalism, possesses a distinctive feature. It has simplified the class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other: bourgeoisie or the capitalist and proletariat. Proletariat are the workers who sell their labor and who do not own their own means of production. They do not own their own tools or their factories, since they do not have the means to produce for their own needs. They instead use their wages to buy what they need. Consequently, he is completely dependent on his wages in order to live. This makes the proletariat dependent on those who pay them wages. Dear friends, capitalists or the bourgeoisie are those who own the means of production. Capital is the money which can make more money, and the owners of capital are the capitalists. Capital cannot increase except by exploiting those who actually work. Capitalists live off the profit of their capital, and they are the beneficiaries of the proletariat exploitation. Friends, Marx believed that the basic contradictions contained in the capitalist economic system should lead to its eventual downfall and destruction. The proletariat would overthrow the bourgeoisie and seize the forces of production, the sources of power. Property would be communally owned, and since all members of the society would share the same relationship to the forces of production, a classless society would result. Here Marx argues that history would end now, since history is the history of class struggle. No class, no struggle, no history. The communist society which replaces capitalism will contain no contradictions, no conflict of interests, and will therefore be unchanging. Marx has distinguished between class in itself and class for itself. A class in itself is simply a social group whose members share the same relationship to the forces of production. He argues that a social group becomes a class fully only when it becomes a class for itself. At this stage, its members have class consciousness and class solidarity. It means the members develop a full awareness of the true situation by the realization of the nature of exploitation. Members of a class develop a common identity, recognize their shared interests, and unite, so producing class solidarity. The final stage of class solidarity is reached when members realize that by collective action can they overthrow the ruling class, and when they take positive steps to do so. A new historical epoch is created by the development of superior forces of production by a new social group. These developments take place within the framework of the previous era. For example, the merchants and industrialists who spearheaded the rise of capitalism emerged during the era of feudalism. They accumulated capital, laid the foundations of industrial manufacture, factory production, and the system of wage labor, all of which were essential components of capitalism. The conflict between bourgeoisie and the proletariat is another example of real material contradictions. This contradiction grows out of previously mentioned contradiction between labor and capitalism. None of these contradictions can be resolved except by changing the capitalist structure. Society will be increasingly polarized into these two great opposing classes. Competition with big factories and companies will shut down many small independent businesses. Mechanization will replace skilled artisans, and even some capitalists will be thrown out through attempts to establish monopolies. All these displaced people will be forced down into the ranks of the proletariat. This inevitable increase in the proletariat was termed by Marx as proletarianization. Marx foresaw a situation in which society would be characterized by a tiny number of exploitative capitalists and a huge mass of proletariat. By reducing so many people to this situation, capitalism creates the masses that will lead to its own overthrow. Friends, the increased centralization of factory work as well as the shared sufferings increases the possibility of an organized resistance to capitalism. Furthermore, the international linking of factories and markets encourages workers to be aware of more than their own local interests. This is likely to lead to revolution. The logic of the capitalist system is forcing the capitalists to produce a more exploited proletariat. These are the very people who will bring an end to capitalism through their revolt. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces is, above all, its own grave diggers. So friends, this was all about conflict theory with special reference to Karl Marx. We will meet again with a new topic. Till then, goodbye.